Hello there and welcome to this very special episode of Hex Arcana, where I have the pleasure and honour of interviewing my wonderful friend and owner of Hex Arcana Publishing, Sarah Daly, who is also a supremely gifted writer whose works have been performed by all kinds of famous folks, from Anne Hatheway to Gary Oldman to Joseph Gordon-Levitt to Channing Tatum, and not just in prose but in verse as well, with songs that have been performed by Sia as well, live on stage. And you made this huge decision to start a publishing company that I have the privilege of helping you with, and together with Tom, we made this fantastic anthology of horror short stories in this book called The Book of Beastly Creatures. It looked like I was having to remember the name. Hex Arcana Volume 1. And we're here today to discuss some of the short stories you've written for this, and your life and work as a writer as well. You know, how you approach these ambitious creations.
So this, the Book of Beastly Creatures, that was the first book that we put out through Hex Arcana, and it's one that I'm very proud of. It was a pleasure to write some stories for it, and also to edit the volume and have a say in how it looks, which I think is pretty beautiful, which is sort of one of the kind of founding tenets of Hex Arcana, is that we not only want to put out original, bold, interesting stories, content, but we want to house those stories in really beautiful physical books, because that's just what we're passionate about. It's a whole experience, reading a book that goes beyond just the words that are contained inside it. So,
Well, I know for myself, I was always really excited by the pulp horror fiction of the 70s and 80s with the painted book covers. Mm-hmm. And I think we've taken that to heart, especially with our paperbacks, The Sound of His Horn, and our upcoming Lord of Tears horror paperback as well, painted by Lisa Falkenstein. Mm-hmm. But this first book, though, is filled with illustrations by James Ollie. Mm-hmm. And all of your stories have many nude women in those illustrations.
just one nude woman, and I guess one nude man, when you think about it.
Man thing, yeah. When we approached this idea, it was to create a story that would feature its own demon or monster. Yeah. And we've called the book The Beastly Creatures, but really these are solid horror stories.
Yeah, absolutely. They're all pretty dark to varying degrees. Some are really, really genuinely chilling, I think. But yeah, the core concept of this book is that each story would have its own very strong, very original, memorable creature, monster, villain, demon, that would stick with you. So,
before I go into your first story, can I ask just about your approach? Because me and Tom, in our videos, which I'm sure will premiere before this one, we blethered, as we say in Scotland, which is of course to chat, mm-hmm. About our approaches. And Tom said that he takes all his notes very carefully and writes them on his hand.
He writes very small.
Yeah, no, quite large.
It's just 3 or 4 really key words.
He does. He likes big ideas with small words that can be written on his hand.
Right. Well, funny enough, my approach is the opposite. I like very small ideas, but use very big words to get those ideas across, because it makes me feel fancy.
For me, when I was chatting to Tom, I tend to be quite compulsive and expressionistic mm-hmm. in my writing. I'm like, meh, and then I have to spend a lot more time editing it to kind of discipline this explosion of creativity.
This unwieldy mess.
But when you were approaching these stories, what was how would you approach it?
I think I'm generally a much more pedantic writer in that I like to do a lot of planning. Like I'll always do an outline before I begin, so I know exactly where my story is beginning, middle, and ending is going to be. I do a lot of research, so I look up, I guess, mythology, for the most part, for inspiration. So I like to always ground my stories in some sense of reality, whether that be a place or in history or in some legend. So I guess, yeah, I'll start out quite in quite a disorganized, chaotic manner, in that I'm just kind of going down rabbit holes looking for inspiration that sticks out to me. But once I have an idea of my monster or my story setup, then I'll quite methodically come up with a story outline, so that when it comes to actually writing the short story, I have a pretty good idea of where I'm going.
So it's quite an intensive process of research.
Yeah, I mean it's intensive, but it's quite fun and freeform in that I usually don't start out with a very fixed idea of what I plan to do. I'll start out with a very vague, loose idea, like maybe I want to have a monster that's a female creature. I want the setting to be in the haunted forest, and I'll use that as my starting point to see what inspiration is already out there around these themes, like what pre-existing real haunted forests are there that might have some mythology around them, or what are some pre-existing strong female monsters or myths.
So with me, it tends to be, I'll struggle, and although I will do some research, I tend to do quite a lot of research, I suppose, in my own way, especially the rabbit holes of Wikipedia, and I know these sites can be. But for me, it tends to be quite a spontaneous inspiration, and then I'll feel a sudden, like all the pieces come together.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Like,
That's satisfying when that happens, for sure.
For me, that tends to be some of the only ways I can really write the way that I want. So I'll end up walking along the street, and then I'll see a three-legged cat wearing a hat, and I'll be like, "Wow, that's it!" You know, a 40-page creepypasta about Dr. Cat Hat. You know.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Well, I guess if it's a creepypasta, it'd have to be called Mr. Crinkly Paws or something.
Mr. Crinkly Paws, yeah. Yeah, it has to be weirdly benign to make it utterly creepy.
They called him Mr. Crinkly Paws. Or crinklypaws.exe, you know, and he appears as a haunted JPEG.
Yeah. Yeah.
Back in the early Newsground chats.
Yes, all very historical.
So, if we go to your first story, the spider mother of Hoyabachu?
That seems about right. Yeah, I don't speak Romanian, so I'm not entirely sure how that's supposed to be pronounced, but I think that's...
And for you folks at home, I'll show you all a picture, which I'm sure we'll transition to. As you see, this particular demon has magnificent breasts, I think we can agree. James Ollie was
captured
clearly
those beautifully.
very inspired by your story, clearly.
We did give him a brief, to be fair. Like, we can't blame James Ollie for that particular wreck.
Yeah. So tell me about the story then. We know this is about a person that's traveling on an adventure of exploration that uncovers a little bit more than they bargained for.
Yeah, I guess I don't know how much I should worry about spoilers here, so I'll give you an idea of the setup.
Oh yeah, and it's good to avoid spoilers.
Yeah. So yeah, this one started with a place, actually. So the forest of Hoyabachu is an actual place in Transylvania that has a lot of mythology surrounding it, a lot of local legends, people going missing. Also, the trees there grow in a very unusual pattern in that they kind of grow at weird angles out of the ground, and nobody really knows why. So I just thought that was a really interesting setting for a short story. So the setup for this one, it's a guy who's basically had a really traumatic incident happen to him. So he responds to one of these ads that's along the lines of, would you like to earn 20 grand a year for living in a haunted forest? That kind of thing, where you often see these things about Scottish islands or whatever. So he responds to the ad and actually gets the position. So he ends up going to this haunted forest in Romania, where he's basically a kind of custodian, just looking after the place. But of course, once he gets there, he begins to be tormented by strange sounds, sees some things in the forest that maybe he didn't want to see, and rouses a creature of the forest that has something of bloodlust, I guess, but for good reason. We'll see why.
So it ends happily ever after, right?
Obviously.
What are the kind of themes that you were exploring with this particular story? Because when you read like mine's, and especially Tom's, the pulp nature is very obvious.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Yours is like the A24 of our horror short stories.
I don't know about that. They're still pretty pulpy.
Yeah.
But I guess I like to always start from a place of character and psychology and an arc. So in this case, it's a man with a dark past, and he's trying to escape it. But in trying to escape it, he actually encounters something potentially even more horrific than what he's gone through. So yeah, I like to put the right, or I guess depending on how you look at it, the exact wrong kind of person in the perfectly worst place they could possibly be, and use that to say something, I guess, about the human condition, I suppose, or about individual psychology.
That's a little bit more sophisticated than Tom's approach. He recently told me the 3 critical elements for any horror short story are boobs, blood, and a screaming man.
And yet all of these 3 things are in my story. Perhaps he is my master, after all.
I always find your stories very easy to read. They manage to communicate complex ideas, thought-provoking things, but in a very easy and enjoyable manner. And that's not to say that it places that as a priority before story. It's intertwined. After reading one of your stories, it feels a little bit like you've read literature.
Oh, thank you. I don't know about that. I guess for me that the whole point is to get the story across in an entertaining but concise way. I'm not a particularly flowery writer. I do like the words to flow nicely. I enjoy a certain poetry, but I'm not the kind of writer that spends paragraphs describing things. For example, I like to keep the story moving, so I try to be as economical as I can, which, to be honest, probably comes from my beginnings as a screenwriter. But I think it works quite well for short story too, in that you don't want to get bogged down in too much detail. I think the point of a story is that you should be able to extrapolate with your imagination what you're seeing. So I don't want to dictate too much of that to the reader.
I mean, yes, it's true. It's actually one of the reasons why I've sometimes found it challenging to read some of Stephen King's books. Despite admiring Stephen King's incredible genius and his amazing storytelling, because his stories, as I understand them, are among my favourites. But sometimes when I've read his books, as you say, he is an author of the type that wants to paint in poetry these very detailed, emotive, almost mise-en-scène kind of environments that might take place from his sense of nostalgia. If he is talking about a diner in the style of a US diner from the 60s, you can kiss goodbye to 5 pages. Talking about the jukebox alone, before it drifts lazily back to the character.
Yeah.
It is its art in its way, but I think for some readers, especially those who do like pulp fiction, we like to have a sense of pace to the plot. Certainly, I'm not saying that Stephen King's books are slow, but it sounds like I'm shitting on Stephen King there.
No, I love Stephen King.
I love Stephen King.
But I hear you. Yeah, there's a merit in setting the tone.
I am the only horror filmmaker that Stephen King hasn't said has made the most terrifying film of the year.
I'll give it time.
I'm just saying, by process of elimination, it kind of should be my turn now, and it's not happened yet.
You would
so,
think
Stephen,
so. Clock's ticking.
If we move to another of your stories,
sure.
The Siren of Silver Falls, and I'll just get to the picture there, which is a very hideous, twisted-looking picture.
She just wants to love you. That's all.
Yeah, I mean,
it's very thoroughly.
very, very thorough lover. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Siren of Silver Falls?
Sure. So the I guess monster in this story is basically a mother who's bent on revenge. It's set in a small town in America where a massacre basically took place in the 18th century, and during that massacre, this woman was basically hacked in two by I suppose a marauder, you'd call him, a colonist, and her children murdered. So ever since, she's sort of roamed this town, looking to lure the children of the colonists to her as a kind of revenge, and she feeds off of their energy so that she can basically continue her vengeful thing. Vengeful
thing.
Yeah.
Thing. So
activities.
This story is quite tragic as well. There is but it does subvert our expectations a little bit with just how horrific it is as well.
It's pretty horrific, yeah. Basically what she does is she'll lure children with her beautiful song, like her lullaby. And often children who feel somewhat unloved or abandoned by their parents, so that they have this strong pull towards her maternal essence. But when she lures them, what happens is her body splits in two, as it did when she was murdered, and she sort of envelops the child inside her like a Russian doll, sort of.
That's incredible, yeah.
So it's pretty dark and horrific, yeah.
Of course, Michael had an encounter as well with her, but he was sent back. Yeah.
Aww.
No, that was a shame.
It's quite the diary entry that day.
Yeah. Did this story take inspiration then from any folklore, or?
Well, it's roughly based on some history of basically a town that was originally settled by the French, and then English colonists came and took over. So there's an element of history in there, but the myth, the legend is all just invented, I guess. So my attempt to create some new folklore.
And both these stories feature strong female antagonists who punish men.
That's a good point. I wonder why.
So story number 3. It's better than the psychoanalysis of Tom's story here. And it walked into the sea, the creature with 1,000 vaginas with teeth. That was
not too hard to decode that one.
Yeah, that was yeah. So we move on to The Curse of Penelec. And this, I remember reading in the form of a short film script some years ago, and to this day, that and the story are absolutely chilling. I think this may well be one of the most, if not the most chilling story in the book.
Thank you.
It's really something quite hideous. And at first you might wonder, well, okay, it's kind of creepy. There's a guy's hand sticking out the sand. And of course we can't give any spoilers on this one. But how did this one come to you? Because it's a remarkable and utterly twisted story.
To be honest, I don't entirely remember where the idea came from. I know that to start with, I basically just got this visual of a hand sticking out from the sand. But what if it's not a dead body? What if it's something alive? So I guess in this story, a man encounters this site, goes and digs it up and finds something that isn't quite what he expects, something very perturbing, and the act of him trying to help this creature has pretty horrendous ramifications for him, basically.
Yes, this particular story for me has an interesting mix of a slight M.R. James and Henry James vibe. There's something Celtic and Gothic about it at the same time. And even you could say Lovecraftian. It taps into several veins and combines them very subtly, but very elegantly. And it does feel like a...
You want to start again? The seagulls are really coming in strong.
Oh, yeah.
We're getting a seagull warning. Seagulls are quite loud outside. They're very frisky at this time of day above our set. And this story feels like a real warning to the curious.
Yeah, I guess. I think it's a central facet of it is that one tiny choice or action can change the course of your life. And I think that's something that's sort of primally terrifying, because none of us like to think that just one split-second decision could damn us. But often that is the case in reality.
But normally that decision sees you meet the love of your life in a romantic comedy movie trailer, not what happens to poor Paul in this.
Yeah, but yin and yang.
It was just an ordinary day.
It would make a terrible rom-com.
Yeah, a terrible rom-com.
Julia Roberts is not going to be in this one.
No. But in terms of like the mythic Lovecraftian element as well, was that influenced by anything at all? Or the way that you use nature almost as something terrifying as well?
Yeah, I think just not inspired by anything in particular, but the idea that nature has within it aberrations. Like there are things that are...
So does our film crews normally as well, to be fair.
That can still be within the realm of nature, but be just a little bit wrong. And that there are things within nature that are terrifying and dangerous, and that make us sort of instinctively recoil. So this is a quite extreme, I guess, example of that. And I suppose that it does give it a sort of a cosmological feel in that it feels like something that's outside of nature, but I really wanted it to feel like a naturalistic story, like a very mundane man on a mundane day, and then this utterly, unexpectedly unnatural thing happens, which I think kind of gives it more power, more punch.
You accomplished that completely. Yeah, I think that's what gives it its power as well. Because you could read short stories where the authors are clearly nerding out on their fandom for Lovecraft or for this or that. But when you read a story that feels like it's an old woman telling you something earnestly, like what happened, that just feels unquestioning. You know, a narrator that has no reason to lie. And so it delivers a chilling story with a sense of truth. That makes it all the more disturbing because you can't challenge it. That's something I think this story achieves really well.
Thank you.
a startling piece of writing. And I remember after reading it as well, because as I had read the short script before, made some years before the story, both left me feeling discombobulated for some time afterwards.
I think there's something about it that it really puts you into the shoes of the protagonist, and you imagine how horrendous and terrifying it would be to have this happen to you. There's something of, I guess, a fear of disease, fear of illness, a fear of your body changing in ways that you can't control, that sort of instinctively repels and terrifies us. That's in that story.
It certainly is. Now we get to a more unusual story with the Randy Dwarf.
Ah, yes, my finest work. It is about a dwarf who is Randy.
Well, apparently the politically correct term is now little person.
The horny dwarf.
The horny dwarf. Yeah. If I was little, I don't want to be called a little person. A dwarf is like Gimli. Gimli is awesome. Oh,
Let's not get into that.
It's another conversation.
That I want no part of. Sink your own ship.
Remember only to cancel me when
Yes, please cancel
when you
Laurie.
get upset with these videos. The next story you wrote was Baldoric.
Oh yeah, I kind of forgot about that one, to be honest.
Is this not kind of a novelette? Is it actually a short story?
I think it's still a short story. It's longer than the others for sure, but I would still say it's a short story. I think it's maybe 6,000 words, something like that. Maybe
That's a
more.
novelette.
Is it? Have I written a novelette? And I didn't
You've-
even know it.
You have, yeah, novelette. So basically, well, there's not like there's a governing board decreeing these things, but I think generally it's considered that any story over 5,000 words
Oh, okay.
could be considered, should it wish to be so, a novelette.
Let's call it that then.
Mm.
Yeah, that was a really fun story to write. It's, I guess, kind of a dystopian story featuring the Owlman, who you know we all know and love at this point. So yeah, it was fun to write something with the Owlman in his usual setting of Balduric House, but with a very different feel. It's a very sort of modern take, much more naturalistic and less gothic, I suppose, than the other stories we've seen with the Owlman. So
You did
yeah,
write
it's quite diversion.
No, you're right about the naturalistic, and it's quite gritty as well. It's an interesting idea. I mean, taking basically this near future dystopia, which when you wrote it, basically just sounds like today. You know,
Yeah,
so
so I predicted the pandemic.
yeah, Sarah was behind it all.
Hey.
So you have a group of characters.
They basically decide to escape the city to go to this big old house in the countryside that one of them owns when basically things fall apart in the city. There's kind of anarchy, chaos because of a variety of different economic factors or whatever. But when they go there, of course, they encounter an altogether different kind of anarchy and chaos and terror. So their attempts at surviving actually see them in a fight for their survival against this ancient creature.
And for folks who don't know, I mean, you can watch the movies with the antagonists of that short story or novelette in Lord of Tears or The Black Gloves. But the Owlman, as an entity in those, in our mythology, in our Hex mythos, is a creature or demon that offers wishes.
Yeah.
Or will grant wishes.
Yeah, he basically grants wishes but demands a sacrifice in order to do so. That's his thing. Yeah.
So each of the characters in the house, are they approached by the Owlman? Or
no, we basically don't understand that a kind of an arrangement has been made until it is almost too late, let's say, that one of the characters is scheming the whole time and not to be trusted. It's sort of how the story plays out. But it's a classic Owlman story, I would say, despite its modern setting. It's very manipulative, that guy. He's got you.
It's my old lungs.
Oh,
I'll
here
take
you
a
go.
little sip of the coffee.
It's just my hand warmer, really.
Thank you.
Very cold in this basement.
Of the stories you've written, which of them do you feel best expresses who you are and what you want to be as a writer?
That's an interesting question. I would say that the Curse of Pinilek is the one that I like the most, and I feel like it has the most sort of profound effect on the reader. Even when I read it, I feel unsettled. So I would say that's, in my view, the strongest one and the closest to the kind of writing I would like to do. It's a simple story, but I think profoundly affecting. And that's, for me, that's the most important thing, that something resonates, whether that's that it resonates in a way that makes you feel terrified or that makes you feel good, or just that makes you feel connected, human. Or just feel things. And make people feel things.
How do you feel about the prospect of a book of Beastly Creatures Volume 2, and also about writing any other works of fiction yourself? Would you ever consider writing a novel, for example?
Yeah, I would love to write a novel. It probably would be either horror or maybe science fiction, but always certainly with a dark edge. So that seems to be what comes out of me. But yeah, I would love to write something in a longer form. And as for the Book of Beastly Creatures 2, yes, that's absolutely going to happen. Just a matter of time, and it will be very much along the same lines, but just exploring some new worlds and introducing some new horrific entities for people to enjoy.
Well, I can speak for Tom on this matter. He's also very excited at the prospect of a sequel, because he'll have an opportunity to use vowels in his next story.
But I love the way that Tom uses consonants.
I would also, if circumstances allow, a chance to write a novel as well. I think for me, I find the pulp horror novels to be quite good as a structure to work with, because they tend to be, for one, shorter,
yes,
and quite fast-paced and plot-driven. 50, 60,000 words. Yeah. It feels like something I could write in and around things, whereas regular novels tend to be 80,000, 100,000. It's like,
on that, yeah. Well, I would love to see you write one.
Oh, it would be fantastic. I'd love to see you write one too.
Well, let's do that then.
And then we could hire a fancy artist to make the covers look great, so we look great.
So that's what it's all about.
Do you ever look at self-published horror authors online and not feel sick?
That's quite a question. What do you mean?
The real question is, what do you feel about the landscape for horror writers at the moment, especially new and emerging writers? And to be honest, although I joked about self-published writers, and I am really joking, I do actually have the real respect, for utmost respect for people who are being entrepreneurial about their creative work, because Christ knows you can't trust corporations or big companies to give a shit about culture for
No, we don't want them
audiences.
to be the arbiters of taste.
But do you feel like, what do you feel about the landscape? Do you think things are good, or do you hope that Hex Arcana Publishing can do something to champion writers, or what do you think?
I mean, I love the idea that people can published these days. And some of my favorite authors that I've read recently have been self-published. People like David Moody, he does an amazing job. But
David Moody.
David Moody, he's always very nice to us too.
What book did you like?
Trust is a good one.
Maybe that's a plug for David Moody.
Yeah,
then.
you go, David.
Trust.
Yeah, he's plugged us lots of times. But his books are amazing, and he does a really
Plugged
beautiful
us
job.
lots of times. I wasn't awake for that, I can tell you.
You had a great time. But it takes a certain kind of person to be able to not only write, but also publish, market, sell, self-promote. These things are difficult, and it doesn't come naturally to everyone.
It's horribly hard.
Really, really difficult. It means you have to
hard.
put so much of your time into that, and not be writing, which is what you want to be doing. So
the same with film as well.
yeah, absolutely. So I mean, for me, if Hex Arcana could be that middle ground that helps people to get their work out there, that brings original, niche, weird, unusual stories to the fore that perhaps wouldn't get there by traditional means, that would be amazing. That's one of the main reasons why we set up this company, is to get that unusual, risky work out there.
Well, that's right. I mean, if we think obviously, we're creating our own work. There's myself, yourself, Tom. But at the same time, Tom, wasn't someone who was able to take that step without working with others. And Sean Hogan as well, who is a great published author, but he didn't have an opportunity to create the work that your publisher helped them to make possible. With the Lord of Tears paperback. And it's great as well that you've given a second lease of life to some paperbacks that might have been forgotten over time, like The Sound of His Horn as well.
It's very satisfying in a lot of different ways, helping people to get their work out there, creating beautiful objects that people can treasure, and also reviving stories from the past that I think deserve more attention. So these are sort of the three, I guess, main principles of Hex Arcana and what it hopes to achieve.
So I want to thank you very much for chatting about your stories in the Book of Beastly Creatures.
A pleasure.
Oh, Queen of Hex Arcana Publishing. And if you guys would like to check out more about the books we have made or are under construction, then you can check out www.hexarcanapublishing.com, or you can visit the book section of www.hexstudios.shop. And there are newsletters and things you can sign up to as well over there that will make you victims of our only monthly propaganda, unless there's something very important like my lingerie lederhosen sale, then you will get more frequent updates, but not often.
They're very flattering.
They are quite flattering. Well, thank you very much, and thank you folks. Please like and subscribe, and hope to see you again soon.